many of you remember that old commercial from the 80s, the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup commercial? Back in the day, that was my very favorite one. And the basic idea is that peanut butter and chocolate literally collide when two people bump into each other. And lo and behold, a great new product is born. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the history of human civilization in a nutshell. It's a meeting at the crossroads. People and products traveling down different trade routes meet, and that leads to the development of cities and towns. And many of the most influential cities develop at the intersection of two trade routes. Ideas and inventions develop in much the same way as cities. It's just the trade at the crossroads is a mental one, an intellectual crossroads of sorts. Sliced bread, for instance. Have y'all ever thought about the inventor? He was an American jeweler from Ohio, and he figured out that cutting bread was similar to cutting stones. So the mixing of a jeweler with a bakery led directly to the greatest thing since sliced bread. Then there's the inventor of the microscopic glass fibers that went into the tiles of the space shuttle. He was a world-class scientist, but he was actually more famous for being an artist who made beautiful, beautiful glass sculptures. So I'm fascinated by stories like these that highlight the intersection of ideas at a crossroads, because I personally experience the powerful creative force that's unleashed when two subjects that don't normally interact are brought together by a chance encounter. In my case, it was my father. He was a professor of medicine at the University of Florida, and he was a specialist in kidneys. So he brought the first dialysis machines to the state of Florida, and he knew a lot about fluid balance and electrolytes. He became close friends with a linebacker who was working as an assistant football coach to the 1965 Florida football team. Now, his players used to sweat a lot, up to 15 pounds of sweat a game. Now, that's a lot of fluids to lose, and it led to a life-changing conversation over a cup of coffee at Chance. Dwayne told my dad, "Do you know my football players never have to pee during a game?" Now that is an interesting thing for a kidney doctor. And that led directly to the invention of Gatorade and the development of a whole new industry in sports beverages and medicine. Most people wouldn't see a connection between very, very sick kidney patients and healthy athletes in the prime of their life. But if you're trained to see connections and patterns as my father was, you're more easily prepared to take advantage of random meetings in the crossroads of your life. Louis Pasteur once said, "Chance favors the prepared mind." So how are we supposed to prepare our minds to see chance when it presents itself? Studying hard, learning facts, that's all very important, but is it enough? Shortly before my father died, he wrote an autobiography. And you would think, being a famous scientist and an inventor, that he would credit his science teachers and professors for laying the foundation that allowed him to succeed. But that's not the case. Instead, he thanks Mr. Gray, his childhood violin teacher. And he thanks him for giving him the gift of music. He calls himself a musician first and then an inventor. He's not alone. Did you know that Nobel Prize scientists are almost 60 times more likely than the general public to be accomplished artists? And what's more, they credit their artistic training with being the secret of their success. It appears that scientists who are trained in the arts can more easily see patterns, shapes, and hidden connections in their data. So if we want to prepare a new generation of creative thinkers, inventors, and entrepreneurs, and I think all of us here do, we need to prepare our students to see patterns and shapes and connections. And what better way to do that than by inserting the arts as a central part of our life and of our civilization? This isn't a new concept. The ancient Greeks actually discovered this thousands of years ago, and they developed an educational philosophy that literally changed the course of Western civilization. Rather than teaching on parallel tracks like we do today, they taught more based on the idea of interlocking subjects, more like the idea of crossroads than parallel paths. They knew intuitively that our minds don't exist in neat compartments, so why should our education system? And what they knew intuitively, we can now prove with brain imaging. I'll talk a little bit about neural networks later, but for now I just want you to focus on, it looks a lot more like trade routes with busy intersections and crossroads than it does in neat compartments. So anyway, the Greeks developed a system that grouped subjects together in such a way that students could see connections. The basic course, which was later named the Trivium, consisted of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And the more advanced course became known as a quadrivium. Now that comes from quadri, which means four, and via, which is roads. So literally where the four roads intersect. It consisted of four subjects: music, geometry, astronomy, and arithmetic. The underlying philosophy of the quadrivium is that all the subjects intersected and complemented each other. Each expressed a unified truth of the universe, and math was a hidden language that tied it all together. I want to spend just a little bit of time now looking at how music and geometry intersect at the crossroads. You've all heard of Pythagoras. He was one of the most famous mathematicians in all of time. But how many of you know that he was also an accomplished musician? He played the lyre beautifully, and he was fascinated by sounds and music, and he wanted to understand, why is music music, and why is noise noise, and what's the difference between the two? So he developed an experiment, and he started by playing an open string. He listened to the sound. He then bisected the string exactly in half from the bridge to the top of the fingerboard. He noticed something really interesting. It was the same note, only one octave higher. He then divided the string into fourths and played 3/4 of the open string. And I'm going to tell you a trick. You will never forget what the fourth note of the scale is. He discovered that's the fourth note because it's part of a very famous song. So if you're ever at a cocktail party and somebody says, "Quick, what's the fourth note of the scale?" you can sing it right away. Here comes the bride. It's the fourth note. Then, when he divided the string into thirds, he found that it was a perfect fifth. So the difference between noise and music is really just about geometry. Pythagoras was the first person who proved that music is math you can hear. Over 2,000 years later, we are blessed by another famous scientist and his discoveries. The theory of relativity, Einstein said, came to me by intuition, and music was the driving force behind that intuition. My new discovery is a result of musical perception. So are Einstein and Pythagoras just two historical anomalies separated by 2,500 years? Is it simply that brilliant people can learn how to play an instrument, or is it the opposite? Does actively learning how to play an instrument lay the foundation for you to be brilliant? There's emerging evidence that this may indeed be the case. This is your brain listening to music, and this is your brain playing music. Various types of brain imaging indicate that playing music actively stimulates neural connections throughout your brain. For instance, if you're listening to a melody or a rhythm, parts of your left hemisphere are activated. When dealing with pitch perception, however, parts of your right brain are activated. What's even more interesting is that the corpus callosum, studies show that children that learn how to play an instrument before the age of 12 grow corpus callosums that are up to 15% larger than normal. Now, the corpus callosum is what allows communication between the left and right hemispheres of the brain. Think of it like a superhighway between two busy cities, or a busy crossroads between two trade routes. Because playing an instrument requires complex coordination between the hands, between the hemispheres, it's theorized that learning how to play an instrument physically lays down more neural connections, and more neural connections are associated with creativity. In fact, when they analyzed Einstein's brain, the only difference they found is that his corpus callosum was substantially larger. So it appears that music actively stimulates neurons throughout the brain that allow you to make creative connections. So it's no wonder that the Greeks called it music, because music was known to stimulate all the creative muses. Just about this time, I think some of you in the audience may be thinking this: thanks a lot, Mom. You didn't sign me up for music lessons. What does this mean for my creativity and the rest of my life? I can promise you won't be on the couch this afternoon because I have good news for you. It turns out that actively participating in any of the arts has positive effects on your brain. And what's even better, the brain is very plastic. It has much more plasticity than we ever dreamed possible. And this means that even into old age, you can actively lay down new neural networks every day. In fact, some studies show that the elderly that take up a new art form, one that they've never done before, whether it's painting or acting or music, they lead longer and healthier lives. So it's never too late to take up an art and really start laying down some new neural networks. I encourage you, you will be so happy you did. And now I'm going to tell you why. Your CQ, which stands for creative quotient, is a bigger predictor of success and happiness for your life than your IQ. Now, the CQ is tested in a similar way to the IQ. It's just that questions they ask are more open-ended. For instance, if they gave you a toy fire truck, they would ask, how many ways can you think to improve this toy fire truck? Or, how many ways can you use this brick? Now, the great news is that creativity can be taught. And what's more, you can raise your CQ, and doing arts of any form is a great way to do that. Now, neuroscientists that study the science of creativity say that there are two modes of thought you have to make creative breakthroughs. The first is called convergent thought, and this is where your thoughts converge on one right answer. We're all pretty familiar with this type of thinking because it's mostly what it's taught in schools these days. It's easily quantified, it's more easily tested, and that's why this is the type of thinking that's most commonly measured in standardized tests. It's a great thing, and it's very important, but it's only half of the equation. To have creative thought, you also must combine it with divergent thought, and divergent thought is the exact opposite. It scans the horizon, looking for all possible solutions. It's not as easily quantified. You can't easily test it, and I think that's probably why we don't teach it too much in schools these days. But the important thing to remember is that creative thought happens at the intersection of convergent and divergent thought. Training in the arts is a great way to train your mind in divergent thought because the possibilities for writing a poem or composing music are endless. They're as endless as the human creative spirit. The Greeks did not really understand the difference between convergence and divergent thought, but they did know this: arts and science should meet on equal terms at the crossroads. We already talked a little bit about how music and geometry met at the intersection of the crossroads. So now I want to do a little experiment. After we've talked about music and priming the neural connections, I'm hoping that your neural connections are primed to see connections when you see these photographs. Do any of you see a connection between these four images? I'll give you a hint. Pythagoras was right. Math is the hidden language that ties together the universe. We'll start with saying that they're all connected by the Fibonacci sequence. Now, the Fibonacci sequence is a series of numbers where the first digit is added to the one before. So 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 1 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8, and so on, into infinity. What's so exciting about the Fibonacci sequence is that you see it throughout all of nature. You see it in architecture, in paintings, in literature. It's a beautiful sequence. So we'll start with the sunflower. Look carefully at the sunflower, and you'll see that there are two interlocking spiral patterns. One is going clockwise, and one goes counterclockwise. Now, if you were to count the spirals, you would see that going clockwise, they measure 21, and going counterclockwise, they measure 34, both Fibonacci numbers. Now, the next time you're walking in the forest and you're tempted to just walk by a pine cone, don't. Pick it up. Take a look. It has a beautiful, beautiful spiral pattern, but the only difference is that the spiral of the pine cone measures 8 in one direction and 13 in the other, also a Fibonacci sequence. The nautilus is no exception. It builds each successive chamber by building a golden rectangle based on the Fibonacci sequence. But Western music also reveals the Fibonacci sequence. So the scale of Western music is based on 8 notes, but the root chord is the first, third, and fifth notes. But if you combine the black keys, it's 13. But I've saved the best for last. If you'll hold up your hand and look at your own hand. The very fingers on your hands grow according to the Fibonacci sequence. So what does this all mean? What does this have to do with anything? Seeing connections and seeking meaning in connections is what creativity is all about. Combining subjects in an interlocking way with the arts interwoven throughout allows you to see connections. Connections allow you to be creative, and creativity leads to a flourishing of people, nations, and cultures. The human creative spirit is truly the most wonderful gift of life, and it allows you to see the world in a new light. It allows you to see the joy and the meaning and the beauty and wonder of life. So training in the arts is not just a nice thing to do, it's an essential component of the human experience. The ancients did not need to understand about neuroscience to understand that poetry, painting, music, and the arts are the flip sides of scientists, inventors, and creative thinkers. The creative thought process unfolds in much the same way. It's just the subject matter that's different. So you could say that inventors are the poets of science, and poets are the engineers of language. Lest you think this is way beyond your grasp, that you just don't have it in it to be creative, that you can't do this, consider this. You have more possible connections between neurons in your own brain than stars you can see in the universe. Connect them. Thank you.